Welcome to video 1. Before we dive into jQuery, let's do a quick video covering some JavaScript basics. I'll be looking specifically at JavaScript variables, arrays, a couple of useful JavaScript functions, and how to create your own custom functions. If you're already familiar with these, feel free to skip on to the next video. First off, let's talk about variables. Variables are important because they allow us to associate a name with our data. They are one of the essential building blocks of this language, allowing us to store and easily access data. We create a variable like this. We start with a var keyword, then the variable name, in this case it's temp, then an equal sign, and then the data we want that variable to hold. In this case it's test. Note that variables in JavaScript are dynamic. You don't need to specify what type of data a variable will hold, since JavaScript looks at that data and figures out its type automatically. For example, test is a string because of the quotes. It will also automatically figure out if it's an integer, a double, a boolean, or an array. Talking about arrays, let me show you how to create one. Do it like so. Var temp equals, and then a square bracket, the items in your array separated by commas, and then a closing square bracket, and finally the semicolon. Arrays are useful for storing groups of related data. I don't think I'll be using them much in this particular course, but I thought I should cover them briefly just in case. If you want to retrieve a specific element from an array, you do it like this. Note that the elements in the array start at 0, so 0 is the first element, 1 is the second element, etc. If you want to get the total number of elements in an array, you use .length, like this. And note that there's no parentheses on this. Length is not a function, it's just an attribute of that array. So parentheses aren't needed. Let's talk about a couple useful functions. One you're probably familiar with is alert, which pops up an alert box with some information that asks the user to view it and then click OK. Creating an alert message looks like this, and it can be useful for displaying information to a user. In many cases, I'll use it as a quick way to debug my JavaScript code, but there are alternate ways to handle debugging, and I'll discuss that later. One other similar function is confirm. This function pops up an alert box that asks the user a question and gives them the option of choosing yes or no. Based on what the user selects, this function will return true or false. And finally, I want to talk about prompt. This function prompts the user for some specific data. Here's how I would code that. You'll note I have the var again, creating a variable, and then I do prompt, and then in the parentheses I put the question that I want to ask the user, and this function will set the variable you specify to whatever data the user types in. Finally, let's talk about custom functions. JavaScript already includes a lot of useful functionality, but how do you code a custom function? It looks like this. We have a function, and we have the name of the function. We have parentheses, and inside those parentheses we'll have any variables that we want this function to use. And then finally, we might return something at the end of that function. Please note that returning data isn't always required. Sometimes you may just have a function that does something, and then that's the end of it. But in often cases, you'll use return to return a bit of data at the end of the function. For example, here's a simple function that takes two numbers, adds them together, and returns the result. You'll note that we're passing in num1 and num2. Those are two variables that this function expects, and then we're returning the sum of those two. If we want to call a function, for example this addition function just above, we can do this. We say var combined, in this case we're creating a variable, that's going to hold the results from addition. We're passing in 1 and 3. So we're going to call the addition method, the addition function, we're passing in 1 and 3, that variable that we created called combined will equal 4. I think that's enough of the basics for now. There might be a couple other things I'll discuss later in this series, but I just wanted to make sure you had at least a basic foundation in JavaScript before we dive into jQuery.